Yes, would you ask Mr. Daly to come back in, please? Thank you. Right, Mr. Daly, you all ready to carry on?
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you very much. Yes, Mr. Millett?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Daly, as your last topic, I want to ask you about something you raised last week, which was the fire safety training to operational personnel pilots. You told us that there was a pilot developed and run at Ilford and at Holloway fire stations before the Grenfell Tower fire. Now, I want to show you a document, and please help me whether I'm right in what it is. LFB 3036223. Now, it's called Fire Safety Training for Station Personnel, 11th April 2017. Is this familiar to you?
Not particularly, because I wouldn't have looked at necessarily the contents of the training, but it looks like the training I've been talking about, yes.
Right. Do you think these were the slides for the pilot?
I couldn't tell you because I wouldn't have delivered that, but
right.
The title would suggest so.
I see. Okay. Let's see how we go. If we look at the notes on the bottom of page 1, you can see that it says, this is the first fire safety training for over 10 years. Therefore, it is aimed at a basic level which can be developed based on the amount of your interaction. You don't have to remember all the detail. A copy of this training will be left on the station and an aid memoir on all pumping appliances. It will not make you fire safety experts. If you're asked for advice, don't guess. Contact your borough team for support. If urgent, call out a senior fire safety officer. Do you remember who created this training?
I don't know.
Do you remember who delivered this training to the crews at Ilford and Holloway?
Off the top of my head, no. There was a few people that were involved in developing the pilots. Group manager Bailey being one.
Bailey?
Bailey.
Right.
Being one, but whether or not he put the package together and delivered the training, I couldn't tell you for sure.
Was it under whose overall supervision was this pilot run?
It would have been as part of the service delivery improvement work that we were looking to undertake. So it would be one of the DACs. But again, at this point, I couldn't tell you which one would have had that reference.
In which directorate?
It would be under the fire safety department.
Okay. Right. I'm just slightly surprised you can't tell me more about it, having raised it.
Only in so much as I gave some direction as to what it was I was looking for. The detail of what was required was discussed in broadest terms, but the actual package is not something that I would have sat and pored over. It should be delivering the ambitions of what the pilot was there to do.
Right. Do you know how the training was delivered? Was it a lecture? Was it CBT? Was it just?
I believe it was a lecture directly to those personnel at those stations for the pilot.
Right. Now, you won't be able to tell this from your screen, but I can tell you that this document is 139 pages long, 120 slides in all. That's a lot of information. Do you know how long the trainers spent presenting this pack to the crews at Ilford and Holloway?
So in terms of this pack particularly, whether it formed part of the same thing, there was a half day's initial training and then a day's training set aside to go through the issues.
Right.
Now, whether that was to deal with the entirety of this pack or this formed one or other aspect of those day and a half input.
And this went to frontliners?
Yes, this was for station-based personnel.
Yes. Now, let's just look at the kinds of information that this presentation includes. Can we first turn to page 12? It's a slide that says, Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order 2005, aims of order, create a single regime which can be better understood and administered by both businesses and the relevant authorities and be based on risk assessment, fire prevention and mitigation measures. And it goes on about the need to protect relevant persons. And it's very much a thumbnail sketch. If we look then at page 13, here's a list of examples, and over to page 14, of the kinds of premises to which the order applies and to those which it doesn't apply on page 14. Doesn't apply to a domestic premises, as it says there. And then if you look at the notes on page 14, underneath the slide, there's a question about whether it applies to seagoing vessels. On page 16, if we go to that, there's a list of enforcing authorities. And the notes then go on to consider who enforces the order in occupied construction sites. Page 17, it considers the interpretation of relevant terms used in the RRO, including domestic premises, relevant persons, etc. And that continues all the way down to page 20. And then on page 21, there's a slide which identifies the powers of inspectors, IOs. And in fact, I think it sets out, by way of direct quotation, the text of the order itself, the RRO itself, doesn't it?
Yes, I believe so.
Yes. Now, I mean, I've shown you really just a dip toe here, but these slides are clearly very rich in information and would have been put together with a great deal of thought. But would it be fair to say that a lot of this is detailed and technical, almost legal information, probably entirely new to operational firefighters receiving this training for the first time?
Yes, absolutely. And I think one of the reasons for undertaking a pilot is to understand to what extent the information is required to undertake the ambitions of the project.
Yes, I see. So this is really it's experimental.
Yes, to a degree, yeah.
Moving a little further on in the presentation, if we can go please to page 28, you'll see there that there's information provided about the aspects of the building which has features. Page 28, there's a reference here to firefighting facilities which under Article 38 of the RRO have to be maintained in efficient working order. Go to page 30, there's information about dry and wet rising mains. At 31, the same. And then 32 and 33, you've got firefighting stairwells, firefighting stairs on 32, firefighting stairs on 33, lifts on page 34, firefighting lifts, and the 35 for the firefighting lobby. Again, I've just shown you a selection of what's in this, but again, would it be fair to say that this presentation is more focused on informing fire station crews about what information fire safety personnel would be looking at, rather than educating operational crews about what information they might come across on building visits or otherwise by way of information?
I think it does two things. I think it sets the context under which we operate and have a protection or fire safety role, but then also gives a lot of information that I would expect potentially in the feedback from the crews and as part of the pilot may be deemed unnecessary for the purpose for which the pilot was developed.
Right. Well, it's part of the purpose of this pilot and therefore these slides to improve the knowledge base of station-based crew so that they would know what it was that they had to communicate to the fire safety department whenever they went on what is called 72D visits, or were otherwise gathering information for the purposes of compliance with Section 7.
I think that's absolutely one of the aspects. I think the other main driver here is, as I say, we carry out a fairly limited number of audits with the fire protection dedicated staff that we have, yet we know in London there's an enormous number of buildings to which the RO potentially applies. Firefighters make up our largest section of the workforce, and probably interact with that environment more than we could with a specialist small team of IOs. So I think the intention is to allow us to have more eyes and ears, if you like, on the ground to then inform us of where there are issues. And I think we always took the view, or certainly I always took the view, that there was the potential here for issues to be raised with fire safety that needn't have been. But equally I saw that as a learning opportunity for crews to learn what wasn't necessary, but for IOs to understand what might trouble or concern operational crews. But that, the more we did the process, the more there would be a natural levelling out and understanding of what the mutual issues are for concern. But absolutely, to help with a better understanding of the regulatory environment, the role that we have in that regard, and to help inform some of the issues they may want to include within 72D information capture.
What was the status of these pilots as at the 14th of June 2017?
I think the training was ongoing. I think if I remember correctly, the idea at the time was that as a watch was trained, they would start to undertake some of the checks rather than wait for the entire station to be trained, because we were conscious there's a lot of information, and it was important that you start to practice the use of that information before it has time to fade.
Are you able to tell us anything about how this presentation was received by station-based crews at those two stations?
I don't have detailed feedback. I know anecdotally there was some concern about the amounts of information, and I think the point you've alluded to, really, the relevance of some of it for the role that we wanted them to undertake.
As at the date of the Grenfell Tower fire, did you have a view as to whether this training and these pilots had successfully increased the awareness of what the fire safety department did?
I think it would be very early to make that assessment, given that the training was rolling out in the earlier part of that year and would take some time to be practised by firefighters. So I don't think it had an opportunity, certainly in those two stations, to embed the intent. And in fact, the process more fully has only recently been rolled out in the last year.
Right. Was there, whether before or after the Grenfell Tower fire, a formal system for adjudicating whether this pilot was successful, which got fed back to you?
There was an evaluation process carried out at some point, I think, after about a year of operation, I think.
And what was the result of that?
I think broadly speaking, again, I can't remember the detail, but I think broadly speaking it was well received in terms of firefighters' overall appetite for that bit of work and information. There was definitely feedback in terms of the training provision, in terms of content and how much and the amount of time possibly required to deliver that training and support it ongoing.
Was anybody on the LFB's operational side aware that this pilot had taken place?
I had the full support of the Assistant Commissioner for Fire Stations, because ultimately this is that individual's group of staff that we were seeking to work with. And it was a commitment that we entered into in our London safety plan. So it was in full view of the wider corporate team and wider senior management team. And it would have been developed alongside the DACs and the borough commanders for those stations as well, to understand that this was an ask being asked of their staff, yes.
And did you ever report back to anybody, for example, the Deputy Commissioner or to the ODCB about how the pilot had gone?
No, I don't think in terms of where we got to, it took a bit of a back step, if you like, because as events unfolded, there clearly became other priorities for the department. I think it's one of the reasons why the full rollout has only happened in the last year or so.
And looking back on it now, and I know it's a hindsight question, but do you think this is a pilot that should have been rolled out far earlier than April 2017?
I think, having come into post only a year before, it's quite a seismic shift. It involves conversations with the RBs around our intent as well, in terms of what we need to do. Getting corporate support for such a different change in the way that we deliver that activity, I think, is important. So there's a lot of stakeholder engagement to do that and developing the pilot. So actually, I think it was a reasonable success story to deliver something that I think I had very clear views on, that something that I feel that in time when we stopped doing regulatory fire safety in the fire service broadly was a mistake. And so it was something I was seeking to rectify now that I had responsibility for that area of work.
Well, Assistant Commissioner, you'll be glad to hear that I've come to the end of my prepared questions. I'm going to ask the Chairman now to call for the usual break to see if there are any questions that I have for you which I haven't asked but should have done, and to see also whether there are any questions from elsewhere. So I'll do that now. Mr. Chairman.
Yes, thank you. Well, as Mr. Millet's explained, Mr. Daly, we have a break at this point, partly to enable him to ensure that he's not left anything out, and partly to enable other people who are following the proceedings but not here can suggest other questions that perhaps we ought to put to you. Okay. So we'll stop now. We'll resume at 2:30, please.
Okay.
And see if there are any more questions for you.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, Mr. Millet, 2:30 then.
Thank you very much.
Right, would you ask Mr. Daly to come back in, please? Right, Mr. Daly, well, we'll see if there are any more questions for you.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, Mr. Millett.
Mr. Daly, you'll be pleased to hear that I have no further questions for you. And therefore, it only remains for me to thank you very much for coming to the inquiry and assisting us with our investigations. We're extremely grateful to you. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, well, Mr. Daly, I speak on behalf of all three of us when I say that it really has been very helpful to hear from you. You've been here quite a long time, and I know you've taken your way from other important matters. So we're particularly grateful that you've given us so much time to help us with our investigations. And thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Right, well, you're now free to go then, and thank you very much for coming.
Thank you. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Well, now, Mr. Millett, we have another witness, I think, in the wings, but we need to rise for a
We do.
moment just for usual.
We do, Mr.
Housekeeping.
Chairman. Yes, that would be helpful. So I'm going to ask you to rise for, I think,
Well,
10 minutes should do it.
I'm going to suggest you ask the usher to come and get us when you're ready.
Very good. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Well, now, Mr. Millett, you have another witness for us, I think.
I do, Mr. Chairman. Can I please now call Dr. Sabrina Cohen Hatton?
Thank you. Yes. Good afternoon, Dr. Cohen Hatton. I gather you're going to make the oath.
Yes.
Right. Well, there should be an Old Testament there to your right. Would you take the book in your right hand, please, and read the words on the screen?
I swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much. Would you like to sit down and make yourself comfortable, please? Right, there's water there if you want it. I'll leave it to you to pour it as you wish. Yes, Mr. Millett.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you. Dr. Cohen Hatton, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
And thank you for coming to the inquiry and assisting us with our investigations. We are extremely grateful to you. As with all witnesses, my questions are intended to be short and simple. Sometimes they're not, and I'm happy to repeat them or put the question in a different way. We'll take scheduled breaks during your evidence. We will take a break this afternoon, even though we've started a little bit late, probably in about 50 minutes or so. But other than that, if you want a break at any other time, please let us know and we can do that. Can I ask you to keep your voice up so that the transcriber who sits to your right can get down everything you're saying? Also, please don't nod or shake your head, a yes or a no. It has to be, otherwise it doesn't go onto the transcript. Now, you've given a Rule 9 witness statement to the inquiry on the 14th of May 2020. I'm going to show that to you. That is at LFB 00110660. There it is. Can you confirm that that is its first page?
That's correct.
Thank you. And can we go to page 26, please? There's a signature under the statement of truth. Is that your signature?
Yes, it is.
Have you read this witness statement recently?
I have.
Can you confirm that the content of your statement is true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
It is.
Are you happy for that statement to stand as your evidence to the inquiry?
Yes, I am.
And there are some exhibits to the statement, I think some 37. Can you confirm for us that you've read those exhibits?
Yes, I have.
And have you discussed your evidence with anybody before coming here today?
Only my legal advisors.
Yes. Now, can I then ask you some questions about, first, your role and your responsibilities? You've put an awful lot into your statement, and therefore what I'm going to ask you is really just by way of confirmation. You began your career, I think, in South Wales Fire and Rescue Service in 2001, is that right?
That's correct.
And in South Wales, I think you occupied initially an operational and then a management role.
That's correct.
And in 2013, is this right, you were seconded from the South Wales FRS to become a member of the National Operational Guidance Programme?
That's correct.
Now, I'd like you to help us understand what the function and the remit of that programme was. First, is it right that the National Operational Guidance Programme was established in 2012?
I believe so.
Yes, and that was, is this right, a joint partnership between the Chief Fire Officers Association, the CFOA, and Local Government Association and the LFB?
That's correct.
Is this right, the purpose of the programme was to create a new catalogue, as it were, of high-quality national operational guidance to be used by all fire and rescue services nationwide?
That's correct. It was intended to replace extant guidance, of which there was a myriad of different pieces.
Right. And, yes, and I think at that time, the existing suite of operational guidance materials was generally considered to be in a poor state.
That's correct.
That's what you say, I think. And there was a lot of material which came from different sources, as you say, piecemeal, and inconsistencies abounded. Mm-hmm. Yes. Now, the National Operational Guidance Programme, is this right, was actually hosted by the London Fire Brigade?
That's correct.
What does that mean, hosted?
The London Fire Brigade hosted the team in their building and co-funded the National Operational Guidance Programme.
They co-funded it?
They co-funded it with the Chief Fire Officer Association.
Right. Does that mean that during your time with the programme, you were physically based at Union Street?
I would work out of a number of different places nationally. We would come for meetings in Union Street. However, as a member of one of the programmes, I was formally seconded to London Fire Brigade as part of the process of being a secondee to the National Operational Guidance Programme.
Right. Now, you say in your statement, there's no need to go to it, but it's paragraph 6, that you led core elements of the programme by drafting elements of the the new incident command guidance,
That's correct.
and also acting, I think, as lead author of the command skills guidance.
That's correct.
Yes. Now, the incident command guidance that you're referring to, I think, is this right, was eventually published in was it July 2015?
That's correct.
Right. And would it be right to say that parts of the guidance that you were responsible for drafting were those parts that related to the research that you've described in paragraph 6, very briefly, about the decision-making process of incident commanders?
That was a component of it. I led on a section that looked at command skills in its entirety.
Right.
So non-technical skills and the human factors that would affect the way an incident commander would apply the process of incident command.
I see. And maybe I'm oversimplifying it, and if I do, let me know. But does that mean basically how incident commanders make real decisions at real live events in real time?
Broadly, along with elements such as leadership and communication, situational awareness, etc.
Now, I think you were then seconded to the CFOA to lead a research programme into the psychology of incident command, weren't you?
That's correct.
And did that secondment take place while you were still working at incident command NOG?
There was an element of overlap, yes, because of the publication timelines.
And what were the dates of the overlap?
The dates of the overlap would have been around the end of 2014, the last 8 months of 2014, I believe.
So some 8 months, 7 months perhaps before publication of the NOG.
Approximately, yes.
And 8 months before the Future of Incident Command paper.
That's
in
correct.
August 2015. Right. Now we're going to come on to the detail of your research with the CFOA shortly, but just putting it again very simply for the moment, would it be right to say that further research sought to test the efficacy of goal-orientated training in improving incident commanders' decision-making processes at incidents?
In short, yes.
Yes, in short. So it built on the research that you'd carried out, I think, before, during your secondment to the NOG.
That's correct. The initial research informed the development of the decision control process. The second programme of research that was sponsored by CFOA tested it.
Right. Yes, I see. Now, following that research work, you, I think, moved to the LFB.
That's correct.
And you then, I think, were employed. Was this full-time as DAC?
Yes, I moved to London Fire Brigade in February 2015 as a Deputy Assistant Commissioner.
Yes. And following a three-month induction, I think you then became Head of Development in June 2015.
Yes.
Now, just on that, I just want to ask you one or two questions about the role and how that fits into the broader structure as we understand it to be of the LFB at the time. Is Head of Development the same thing as Head of Learning, Development and Strategy, or LDS?
No, I believe there were some differences. There wasn't a Head of Learning, Development and Strategy when I moved into that position. I believe there'd been several restructures. So the areas that I was responsible for as the Head of Development were personal development and also organisational development.
Right. And how did that differ from Learning, Development and Strategy?
I wasn't employed in the London Fire Brigade when they had that post in place, so I'm afraid I'm not best placed to answer how it would have differed precisely.
Does that mean that the role of LTS had disappeared by the time you joined?
I believe so. Are you referring to the role that was previously occupied by DAC Kevin Hughes?
Yes.
Yes, that was some time prior to my joining London Fire Brigade. There was no Head of Development when I initially joined. It was a new position.
Right.
So I'm afraid I'm not able to compare and contrast the previous position because of the restructures.
To whom did you report in your role as Head of Development?
Peter Groves.
Peter Groves. Now, you say in your statement that your responsibility in that role included leading the Personal and Operational Development Directorates, which I think within which was a team that acted as like a conduit between LFB departments, the commission training and the external training provider. Is that right?
Yes, but it was the organisational development. I think you said operational. I think that was a mistake. It's organisational development.
It was me misreading my note.
Sure.
Personal and organisational development.
That's correct.
Now, the external provider was Babcock, I think. Yes?
That's correct.
There's nobody else. Now, when you refer to the team that acted as the conduit between the LFB and Babcock, is that right? Is it right that that was the team that managed the process under which new training was requested by the LFB?
That's correct. They would provide the conduit between the commissioning department, who would request the training, and Babcock. So they would act as the project managers, effectively.
And what was the name of that team?
That was personal development.
That was personal development, right. And to be clear, is the process that you've just described that we've seen referred to in the various training documents known as TCAP, the Training, Commissioning and Alterations Process?
Yes, that's correct.
Right. And would it be right to say that you or your team, at least you from February 2015, oversaw that process from start to finish?
That's correct.
Right. Now, in March 2016, you say that you were appointed as Northwest Area DAC at the LFB.
That's
Yes,
correct.
yes. Was that a role that you fulfilled alongside your training and development related role, or did that role, the training and development role, stop when you became Northwest Area DAC?
No, that role stopped, although I did continue to lead the revalidation programme, or the development of the revalidation programme, I should
Yes,
say.
and we're going to come to that later in your evidence. In June 2017, very shortly before the Grenfell Tower fire, I think you were made DAC of the Operations Review Teams.
That's correct.
Team, also ORT. And that included, as I understand it, governance of the DOT system, the Dynamic Intelligence Operational Training System. Yes?
That's correct.
Yes. And after the Grenfell Tower fire, November 2017, I think you were then seconded to Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary and Fire and Rescue Services.
Yes, that's right.
Right. Now, since that time, you, I think, have left the LFB completely, haven't you?
That's correct.
And you are now currently Chief Fire Officer of the West Sussex Fire and Rescue Service.
That's correct.
Now, I think also, standing back from fire brigades, is it right that during your career you've also achieved a number of higher educational qualifications, including a PhD in psychology?
That's correct.
And I think you've also been awarded a number of honorary research associateships and fellowships at Cardiff University, yes?
Yes, that's correct.
And exactly 2 years ago last week, I think on the 29th of September, you were a guest on BBC's Desert Island Discs. Is that right?
That is correct.
And we can hear some more about your career and your experiences on that. Now, research undertaken during the NOG review, I just want to ask you about that. And first of all, decision-making models within that. I want to ask you about the research you carried out while you were seconded to the NOG programme, which, as you've confirmed, was from 2013.
Yes, that's correct.
If we just look at your statement, please, and go to page 6, LFB 00110660, page 6, paragraph 25. You've got a heading, Research Undertaken During NOG Review, and you say there that you propose that research should be undertaken in conjunction with Cardiff University, whereby data would be collected from a range of fire and rescue services on how incident commanders made decisions in line with the extant models. I led the research team that accompanied incident commanders for 24-hour periods over 6 consecutive days for a period of 6 weeks. We recorded footage of the entire incident from the perspective of the incident commander using helmet cameras. We developed a cognitive interview, which we performed on incident commanders following their attendance at incidents, along with psychometric tests. The research team then analysed the data and drafted a research paper on the responses of incident commanders. Now, you had actually already, I think, done some research on the decision-making model.
That was the initial research on the decision-making model.
That was the research.
That was the initial research, yes.
And that research on the decision-making model, which I think you refer to at paragraph 25, was on the, is this right, was on the effectiveness of normative models of decision-making?
Yes, that's correct, of which the decision-making model was effectively a normative decision-making model.
Could you just explain to us what a normative model of decision-making is?
Of course. Normative decision-making models assume that decision-making is made in a very linear way. For example, an individual would assess a situation and gather information that way, and then develop a plan, and then execute a plan. There were many examples of normative decision-making models, but it would assume that the decision-maker was effectively evaluating the course of action and choosing the most optimal.
Yes. So the research on the effectiveness of normative models was a part of the development of the NOG that was eventually published in July 2015.
Yes.
Now, when that happened, when it was published, am I right, it was issued alongside, or very shortly before, a different report by the CFOA called The Future of Incident Command?
Yes, that's correct. The Roy Wilshire, who was at the time the Director of Operations for the Chief Fire Officer Association, wrote to all Chief Fire Officers to note to note the content of the Future of Incident Command report, and to say that there was an expectation that the National Operational Guidance for Incident Command would be adopted by the 1st of January 2016.
Right, and we'll come on in some detail to that document, but let's just let's look at it. LFB 00118236. There's the first page. You can see the date, August 2015. And I think I'm right in saying that it explains some of the background to the revised guidance, including some of the issues that had led to your own research.
That's correct.
Can we go to page 9, please, and look at the first paragraph on page 9. On page 9, there's a heading, Catalyst for Change, National Operational Guidance for Incident Command Literature Review, you see. And that then refers to a review comprising documents, reports and reviews of critical incidents, both within the fire and rescue sector and I think other industries. Now, I think that's the same literature review, is this right, to which you refer in your statement as having been carried out by Group Manager Philip Butler of the LFB.
Yes, that's correct.
Now, any new Incident Command National Operational Guidance reflected and took account of the important lessons learnt from those incidents.
Yes, that's correct.
Yes, and I think I'm right in saying that Group Manager Butler, or Phil Butler, as the case may be, went on to work with you in the research that you then carried out relating to decision-making at Cardiff.
Yes, that's correct.
Now, going back to this report, looking at the first paragraph, can we just pick it up about halfway down the text where it says this literature review? And it says this literature review confirmed human factor failures, human error, can impact on all elements of incident command. An absolutely critical need was highlighted for the revised guidance to emphasise the importance of command skills, in particular situational awareness and decision making. It was important to consider both people and processes to improve incident command in the operational environment. Now, just to be clear, when the report speaks of human factors, would it be right to say that that's a term given to human characteristics or skills as opposed to technical knowledge or technical skills, which may influence operational performance on the fireground?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah. Now, can we go to paragraph 24 of your statement? We'll come back to this shortly. But can we go to paragraph 24 of your witness statement? And you refer to your own research there, and you say, in the second sentence, command skills are non-technical skills considered necessary to act effectively as an incident commander. Examples of command skills include situational awareness, decision-making, communication, leadership, and resilience. Now, basically, that's the same, isn't it, as human factors?
Yes, that's
as are
correct.
the human factors. Would it be right to say that decision-making is one aspect of human factors that plays a central role in how effectively individuals are able to perform in a command role?
Yes, that's correct.
Right. Now, if we go to page 10 of the Future of Incident Command report, you can see that there's a summary of the literature review, which I think included, in relation to incident command's decision-making specifically, a number of features. If you go down the page to the third subheading, Review of Incident Command Decision-Making, it says this: the literature review identified that the area of psychology of incident command, and in particular operational decision-making, needed to be expanded significantly in the refreshed National Operational Guidance. There were a number of issues identified in relation to decision-making. The predominant criticism is that it was not prominent enough in Incident Command Manual, CFARU 2008, given its critical nature for incident command. Now, 2008, the Incident Command Manual of that year was I think, is this right, was what the new Incident Command National Operational Guidance of 2015 was intended to replace.
Yes, that's correct.
And to summarise it, is this right, that what the literature review discovered was that the 2008 manual didn't sufficiently emphasise the importance of decision-making as a critical concept in relation to incident command.
Yes, that's correct, amongst other command skills.
Amongst other command skills, including the human factor.
Yes, that's correct.
Yes, I see. And was it considered important that the new incident command NOG should consider the concept of decision-making in more detail, including the human factors?
Yes, that's correct. The primary issue with the previous National Operational Guide, or the previous Incident Command System, as you were, was the fact that it was very focused on process and omitted to consider how people might interact with those processes and how they might effectively work in practice.
Yes, I see. And was that why you carried out the research that you did during your secondment to the NOG?
Yes, there was very little work on human factors that had been undertaken in the Fire and Rescue Service. There was lots in other industries, but very little in the Fire and Rescue Service. And although those skills might be common across various industries, the context is important. So we felt it important to explore those in more depth within the context of the Fire and Rescue Service in which they'd be applied.
Yes, I see. Now, can we then go back to paragraph 25 of your statement on page 6? And you say there that as part of the research we consider the effectiveness of normative models such as the extant decision-making model, DMM, and you go on to explain, as you have just now, what the normative model is. And paragraph 27, if you turn the page, what you say there is such models assume it's a rather long paragraph, but it's the fourth line down. Such models assume that decisions are made analytically, where options are considered, evaluated, and activity is planned. And if we look then at your paper, following your research, we'll find that at LFB 00110667. Let's go to that. Here's the title: An Investigation of Operational Decision-Making in Situ, Incident Command in the UK Fire and Rescue Service. And you can see the three authors there, of which you are the first. We'll come back to the specific findings in your research and your article later on, but just for the moment, in relation specifically to the normative model of decision-making, could you go to the bottom of page 1? If we could scroll down to that and look at the right-hand column. Note on the left-hand side that the date of this is August 2015, so the same month as the Incident of Future Command CFOA paper. And on the right-hand side, it says reflective models of operational decision-making. And it says Dewey, 1933, argued that when people solve problems, they do so in an analytical and rational way that proceeds according to an orderly sequence of phases. These ideas are echoed in normative models of decision-making that typically identify three key phases: situation assessment, SA, plan formulation, PF, and plan execution, PE. And to summarise it, you then go on to say that normative three-phase model can be detected in the then current decision-making model adopted in the Fire and Rescue Service Incident Command System, current in the United Kingdom.
That's correct.
I'm summarising it. That's a third of the way down that column. Is that a reference to the 2008 Incident Command Manual we've just referred to?
Yes, it is.
Right. Now, if we can look at that manual, the 2008 manual, and in fact you do actually refer to that, you say CFRA 2008. Let's look at that. That's at SMC 6013. Let's just look at the first page to make sure we're talking about the same thing. That's the document.
Yes, it is.
And if you go to page 18, you can see on that page, in the right-hand column, 1.9, incident management and decision-making. And what that says in the second paragraph is this. There's a description of the processes in the first paragraph. And then it says, however, such a description of the cognitive processes is not a tool. In the search for a device to practically assist commanders in the discharge of their responsibilities, experienced officers have reported the value they have derived from the decision-making model developed by the London Fire Brigade. See Figure 1 overleaf. And we're going to come to look at the LFB's DMM, or decision-making model, in more detail shortly. But at the moment, if we could just look at the figure that's reproduced on the next page of the 2008 manual, there it is. Would it be right to say that the three vertical bars in red, purple or blue and red reflect the three stages of the normative decision-making model that you've described in your paper?
In essence, yes.
In essence. Now, so just to be clear about this, to explain it, think, which is in red, is that situation assessment?
Yes.
So you take into account the information outlined on the left side of the diagram in the blue boxes, yes?
Yes.
So resources, incident, hazards, and then you think about it, and then you prioritise objectives, and then you plan. That's the plan formulation, is it?
Yes.
PF, yes?
Yes.
Yes. And then outcome is, in red, is plan execution.
The communicate and control element is the plan execution, and the outcome would be the outcome of that. But in essence, yes, your assumption's correct.
I follow. So to put it into the three-stage language, think is SA, plan is PF, plan formulation, and communicate and control is plan execution.
Precisely.
Right. So in fact, the three stages are actually red, blue, and then the two yellow boxes.
Yes.
Right. Now, okay, it looks as if the 2008 Incident Command Manual was essentially endorsing this normative, linear approach to decision-making. Am I right?
Yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt, Mr. The word normative has been used quite a lot. Is it used in this context to mean not quite prescribed, but standardised method or approved method, something along those lines?
Commonly assumed, yes. It was the commonly assumed belief that decision-making would happen in that very rational way.
But normative suggests something that's controlling, not normal, but normative, setting a standard. Is that right?
I think it was more as in a normalised approach to it. So a more assumed approach would be that it would happen in those three distinct phases in a very rational way.
Yeah. That it would or should?
That it would. It was assumed that described how decision-making happened, and the literature at the time, when it was analysing the way decisions were made, it was done according to that psychological premise.
Yeah. All right. Thank you very much.
So your psychological premise is an interesting way, perhaps an insight into the answer to the question that the chairman asked. Is it right? Normative doesn't denote or connote any sort of designed process, but a collection of the way people are regarded as doing things.
In terms of a normative model, yes. This particular model, as described by the Incident Command Manual at the time, was the model that people should have been expected to have been using when they were making decisions on the incident ground. It was the extant tool for making a decision. And as such, it was very often the tool that was used to judge the efficacy of someone's decision following the outcome of that event.
And the underlying assumption in the tool is that a normative approach would be taken. In other words,
Yes.
a linear and rational one.
Yes.
Yes, I see. Your paper points out, I think, so we'll just go back to it, please. LFB 001106667, page 2, left-hand column. We look at the lower down the page, scroll to the bottom, left-hand column, last sentence, however, you see what it says. It says, however, the fact that the normative model, which is what we've just been looking at, is embedded within training and operational guidance need not mean that it represents how decisions are made in practice. So is it right, in fact, that since the 1990s, in fact, further research on decision-making has been carried out, and that more recent research supported alternative models for the way in which decisions could be made or should be made?
Yes, that's correct.
Right. And specifically, is this right, that the research had shown that decisions can also be seen to have been made on a much more reflexive basis, drawing on intuitively on past experience, on what that incident commander happens to know, rather than acting on an analytical assessment of possible options before formulating an explicit plan?
Yes, that's correct. Around 80% of the time we found that to be the case when people were making decisions on the incident ground.
I see. So, put it another way, is it right that your research showed you that the normative model in the 2008 CFRA was all very well, but that's not how people worked in practice?
Yes, that's correct.
But could it be suggested that what we might in common parlance call intuitive decision making is actually just short-circuiting the rather more analytical approach to decision making? In other words, you see something, you react to it because of previous experience, and the process, in a sense, encapsulates obtaining information, processing it, and deciding it, but all as one part of one intuitive decision.
Yes, that's one way of describing it. There were two ways in which you might predominantly use a very intuitive process.
Yeah.
One is precisely as you described, called recognition-primed decision-making, where an incident commander will have previously experienced something similar and will have essentially a prototype in their mind that they would move to. That would mean they would short-circuit that. They'd be operating on a bias, essentially, and taking an action based on what they've previously experienced. In those circumstances, we know that incident commanders are choosing an option that is satisfactory as opposed to optimal, however. The other mechanism...
That might depend, mightn't it?
It might. The other mechanism that might underlie it is something that is more based on associative learning mechanisms. So it might be something that is even more reflective, where a particular cue in the environment might bias a response directly to a particular outcome or a particular response.
Well, presumably you can get bias, if we're going to use that word, though it's rather loaded, in any form of decision making, because even your analytical normative process is susceptible to taking a certain view of each previous stage. But it strikes me at the moment that the reflexive or intuitive approach is not actually entirely at odds with the normative approach. It's just telescoping it.
Potentially, and I should say when I refer to bias, I'm referring to cognitive bias
Yeah.
because of the previous experiences that you might have had. In some respects, it might be considered as short-circuiting that, but of course, that's basic. That's assuming that the plan formulation stage will have happened at some time, where actually what the incident commander might be doing is recognising a situation and recognising an outcome that was previously associated with that. So the plan formulation may or may not be implicit in that circumstance. And of course, it might be the appropriate response for that particular cue in the environment, but given every environment is different and every incident will be novel, it may have unintended consequences for the rest of the situation should that option be selected.
Yeah. Right. Sorry to interrupt you, Mr. Millett. Interesting ground.
Yes. Yes. Now, can I then go back to the future of incident command? August 2015, we looked at earlier. LFB 00118236, page 14. Here we have quite a lot here about intuitive, reflexive components of decision making. And I fear I should read this to you just so that everyone can see what I'm asking you about. It says this: whilst the kind of analytical reflective models of decision-making represent one way in which decisions can be made, it has also been argued that they do not capture how decisions are often made in the real-world environment, Klein, 1993. Instead, decisions are often influenced by various biases and involve the use of heuristics, including those based on previous experience. For example, Gigerenzer, 2007, Shafir, 1994, Tversky and Kahneman, 1979. I think that should be 1974, actually. Also, cues in the environment, in this case at an incident, can prime knowledge structures that include actions, goals, and expectancies previously related to that or similar environments. For example, recognition-primed decision-making, Klein, 1993. In such cases, various options are not necessarily evaluated against one another, but rather the decision to act might be one that is deemed to be satisfactory rather than optimal. This is the point I think you were making to the chairman just now.
Yes, that's correct.
And that's Abernathy and Ham and Klein. Alternatively, the basis for an action might be more reflexive as opposed to reflective, and automatic, affected by previously established associations that have developed between their situational cues, actions and outcomes. Doyer, 2008. These acquired associative influences can easily generalize across situations and affect behavior in a variety of ways. For example, Balain and Ostland, 2007, Cohen, Hatton, George, Haddon and Honey, 2013, Dickinson, 1980. These more reflexive influences might or might not be appropriate to the given operational environment. Nevertheless, they could exert a powerful influence over incident command. Now, just pausing there, that passage in this paper, The Future of Incident Command, is lifted, I think, almost verbatim from your article of the same month, wasn't it?
Yes, it's very similar.
I mean, there are one or two transcription errors. For example, the title of your joint 2013 article is the wrong way round, I think. And the date of the Tversky and Hahnemann Classic is 1974 and not 1979. But leaving aside those little inconsistencies, my question, I'm afraid, is a bit of a blunt one. Did the CFOA ask to crib your work?
I wrote this report.
Right, so you cribbed your work.
I cribbed my work.
Right.
Yes.
Continuing, whilst such processes were acknowledged in the Psychology of Incident Command appendix in the Incident Command Manual, CFARU 2008, they are not reflected in the VMM, which represents an analytical and reflective processes. This would require relatively slow time, reflective and conscious deliberation in order prioritising objectives or tactical planning, which may not always be feasible in a dynamically changing, high-pressured and high-risk operational environment. Now, is it right, therefore, that by the time you came to be seconded to the National Operational Guidance Programme to work on incident command guidance, as you've explained, would it be right to say that there was already a body of thinking out there that recognised that the traditional normative decision-making model involving explicit situation assessment, plan formulation and plan execution may not in fact reflect how decisions are made in reality?
Yes, that's correct. And some of that was reflected in Appendix 4, I believe, to the National Incident Command Manual in the Psychology of Incident Command Appendix, which outlined a small piece of material looking at recognition prime decision making. But
Yes.
that had not translated into the decision making model.
No, we may come to that indeed, but thank you. Am I right in thinking also, just taking it in stages, that the more recent research didn't tend to be based on operational decision making in the fire and rescue sector? It came from elsewhere.
The majority of research had come from elsewhere. There was some that was based in the Fire and Rescue Service, predominantly Gary Klein's work. However, that was based on retrospective interviews, sometimes carried out sometime after the event, which obviously relied on people's memory as opposed to collecting data when it was happening.
And I think also simulations.
Correct.
Yes. Can we go to page 12? I think we see that summarised, in fact, in this paper a little bit earlier on. If we go to page 12 and look at the third and fourth paragraphs on that page, I think the point you've just made is reflected there. Whilst there is a large body of work looking at general decision-making processes, there is a relatively limited amount conducted into operational decision-making with fire officers. Although the mental processes may be similar, the way in which they're implemented can differ according to the task and the context. Hence, most safety-critical industries explore these processes in the industry environment. NOG 2015, there is comparatively little research conducted within the operational fire and rescue context, which leaves a gap in our knowledge relating to how these processes might affect us during incident command. And then the next paragraph essentially tells us what you've just told us. The small amount of research that does exist is limited to either simulations or interviews after an incident, Klein, Calderwood, McGregor. These studies can provide only relatively distant clues about decision-making at emergency incidents. And it goes on to say, critically, many of these studies rely on the accuracy of participants' memory for events, etc. Did you write this part of the document?
Yes, I did.
You did. Now, the research that you intended to carry out sought to plug the gap that we've identified here. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
And in the sense that you were intending to follow fire and rescue incident commanders as they attended real live incidents, monitored their decision-making processes in real time as a sort of controlled experiment.
Yes, that's correct.
I see. And would it be right to say that your rationale for carrying out that research was in order to say that incident command NOG, which would then be reflected in policy at local level and nationwide training, should properly, and I say properly, realistically reflect the way operational personnel in fact make decisions on the ground in real time?
It was partly an intention to do that and partly an attempt to find techniques to support those decision-making processes.
To support them?
Yes.
Techniques to support them. Can you just explain what you mean by that?
Yes, in terms of the decision control process, the implementation of the decision controls in particular were aimed at helping incident commanders when they were making decisions to help to avoid some of the decision traps or the unintended consequences of those reflexive decisions that we saw were so often used.
I see. We'll come to the decision trap very shortly. Before we come to the detail of your research that you carried out as part of the NOG programme, I just want to look at the model itself that was, I think, the case at the time of your research and remained the case on the night of the 14th of June 2017. You've told us that the decision-making model is an example of a normative decision-making model. Could you just, I think you can confirm that that is so?
Yes.
Let's look at it. It's at LFB 50238. It's policy number 341. And this is the version viewed as current on the 27th of November 2014. So it was, can we take it that this was the policy that you were examining for the purposes of the National Operational Guidance Programme work you were doing?
Yes.
Now, if we go to page 2, we can see that there's a diagram which sets out the process, I think, in a single image. Is that right?
Yes.
And if we look at that, I won't describe it, everyone can see it, but if we go to the next page, we can see under Introduction, it says, this policy introduces the decision-making model as a tool for dynamic risk assessment, DRA. The model provides a framework for decision-making for any task or event. As discussed in policy number 342, dynamic risk assessment, every individual requires the skills to apply its principles in order to control the risks associated with an activity. The decision-making model is therefore applicable to all, bold, personnel at all levels. And then if we turn to page 4, we can see paragraph 2.1 under the heading, the decision-making model. The DMM is formed around two main activities, deciding and acting. Each stage identified in the model falls into one of these activities. And then if you look at the deciding part, that's got elements of situational awareness, I think. Is that right?
Yes.
So if you look at the first bullet point under deciding, you've got gathering and thinking about all available information, followed by elements of plan formulation, identifying appropriate objectives, defining a plan. Yes?
Yes.
And then under the acting part, you've got communication, control, and evaluation. And they all relate to the activity that's being done.
Yes.
Yes. So I just want to ask you about the planning stage under this model, the DMM. Now, that's on page 9 of the policy, over to page 10. Can we just go there? The plan. Now, is it right that once you get to this stage, the decision maker is supposed to have gathered the relevant information and used that information to identify a series of objectives that need to be achieved?
Yes.
And if you look at paragraph 9.1, it says, this stage in the process requires that prioritised objectives be developed into plans that are achievable and take into account the need to reduce any risk to acceptable levels. Would it be fair to say, just on what I've shown you so far, Dr. Cohen Hatton, that this part of this policy doesn't actually provide any guidance to how a decision maker might actually go about formulating a plan at all?
That's correct.
It simply tells you that the plan should be achievable, should reduce risk to an acceptable level, and if you go over the page, you'll see this at 9.4, should be designed to deliver the required outcomes.
Yes.
Now, is that because it's just not possible to formulate universal guidance for how an operational plan should be put together?
I think that it is possible to provide more guidance than this, and in the decision control process, that element of plan formulation was unpacked slightly to reflect to reflect objectives, so those primary objectives that you would come up with in your incident plan, but then also to consider your tactical priorities and then the operational tactics that you would use to enable you to achieve that. So there was an attempt to unpack that further to provide more support to decision makers when they were making a decision during incident command.
Right. My question is slightly different. I mean, maybe mine was oversimple, but is the problem that you can't really formulate on paper universal guidance as to how an operational plan should be put together, because it would depend on what was in front of you, the situation?
Yes, there are some principles that would be helpful, but you're correct that there are so many variations that it would be very difficult to pre-prescribe a plan that would meet the needs of every potential incident that you might come to.
Right, but you also, I think, just trying to unpack your answer, or perhaps repack your answer. Was it in fact the problem that it was possible to give generic guidance as to how to formulate a plan, but the problem was that this policy just didn't do it?
I think an additional part of the issue was that wasn't reflecting the reality of how decisions would be made. Right. Therefore, it would only reflect a very small subset of the decisions that were being made as well.
Let's look at the related policy that's referred to here before we go further, and that's the dynamic risk assessment. That's at LFB 50238. I'm sorry, I've already read this to you. I don't think we're looking at the policy itself, but there's a reference back to page 1 of that policy in this policy. If we go to page 2, paragraph 1.1, sorry, page 3, paragraph 1.1. I've shown you this. It refers to the dynamic risk assessment policy. Can you just tell us in simple terms what you understand a dynamic risk assessment, at least the one captured by the dynamic risk assessment policy 342, to be?
Certainly. A dynamic risk assessment would essentially help you to identify the hazards that you might come across and the risk that they might pose, or the likelihood of them posing a risk. And then the opportunity to consider how you might be able to control those measures, what you might be able to do to reduce that risk of happening, to determine whether it was safe to proceed or not. In an incident command capacity, we would use a dynamic risk assessment in particular to ascertain whether it was safe to proceed to put firefighters into the risk area, in which case it would inform your tactical mode as offensive, or whether the risks were too great and you weren't able to commit firefighters into that risk area yet, which would then make it a defensive tactical mode. So the outcome of the dynamic risk assessment itself would inform your tactical mode specifically.
I think I see that, but would it be right to say that a dynamic risk assessment involves a process whereby the incident commander gathers evidence continuously through the incident in order to devise a plan and revise a plan that takes into account particular circumstances and hazards as they change?
Yes.
And can you explain then how the decision-making model relates to the dynamic risk assessment as a policy or as an idea?
In short terms, the dynamic risk assessment would be something that you would do alongside the decision-making model as it was outlined here, that would help to inform the action that you would take. They are separate. In the national operational guidance that we produced, the decision control process, which replaced the decision-making model, and the dynamic risk assessment elements were separate within that. all people on the incident ground would be able to make a dynamic risk assessment to ascertain how safe the environment was that you were going into or operating in, whereas the decision-making model or the decision control process latterly would be a tool that would be used by the incident commander in deciding how they would proceed with the incident more generally.
Right. Let's then look at the dynamic risk assessment policy now, which is LFB 50236. And it was the one as issued in August 2016 as current. And if we go to page 2, you can see the key point summary there. And if you then go to page 8, you can see the concept of operational discretion. It's section 6, operational discretion. And paragraph 6.1 says this: due to the fast-moving and varied nature of fire service operations, it is not possible for the authority to provide explicit guidance that will satisfactorily cover all situations. On the rare occasion that operational guidance does not meet the needs of the incident, ICs can adapt or move away from an operational policy where this is necessary and justifiable in terms of risk versus benefit. Now, does the reference to operational guidance there include the decision-making model?
Sorry, in which?
In the third line in paragraph 6.1 of this policy, which is the dynamic risk assessment policy.
Oh, I see. I think the reference in this line in particular, when it talks about operational guidance, they're relating that to standard operating procedure, so a policy that might be applicable to a particular incident type, as opposed to the national operational guidance for incident command.
Oh, I see. So like grasslands.
Yes, so it might be that applying that particular piece of policy in its entirety might inhibit your ability to resolve the incident, or the incident itself might be so rare that you don't actually have a standard operating procedure that's appropriate for that.
Right. I see. We saw a reference to discretion more generally. Would an incident commander use the dynamic use the DMM itself to decide when to depart from it, or would he use the dynamic risk assessment?
He or she would use either one of those. The dynamic risk assessment would allow you to identify whether it was safe to proceed or not. The decision-making model, as it is in London, should help you to develop your incident plan, but actually in reality the situation that you're faced with would enable you to identify whether there is an applicable policy or whether it's feasible to apply that policy.
Right. Put it another way, does the DMM ever contemplate departure from itself?
There's nothing in the DMM that would support a decision maker in that process, no.
And indeed, you're right, there's nothing in the DMM which averts to the need to consider the possible exercise of operational discretion.
That's correct.
Yeah. Does that mean that an incident commander might get stuck in the DMM because they've got no signposted means of escaping from it?
That's correct.
Right. If you're going to use operational discretion, at what stage in the process is envisaged by the DMM would you expect an incident commander to consider whether it's necessary to exercise his or her discretion to depart from it? At what point?
If you were relating it to the decision-making model specifically, then one would imagine it would be under the planning section. But again, from our experience in the research when we were watching decision makers on the incident ground, actually there is a much more complex situation unfolding, whereby we weren't often seeing incident commanders running through that process and developing a plan. Rather, there were particular cues in the environment that might be triggering a response. So in the situation where operational discretion might be required, it would be at the point where the decision maker would recognise that responding to that particular cue with the outcome that they might have been envisaged might not be suitable for the incident itself.
Yes, I see. Yes, thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, we've had about 50 minutes. I think this would be an appropriate moment.
I think we should have a short break, yes. Dr. Cohen, Hatton, we have a break normally during each session for everyone's benefit. So I think we'll take a break now. We'll come back, please, at 3:45. And as with all the other witnesses, I have to ask you, please, not to discuss your evidence or anything relating to it with anyone while you're out of the room. All right?
Sure.
Thank you. Would you like to give the usher, please?
Thank you.
Thank you. 3:45, please. Would you ask Dr. Cohen Hatton to come back in, please? Right, Dr. Cohen Hatton, ready to carry on?
Yes, thank you.
Good, thank you very much. Yes, Mr.
Yes,
Millett?
Dr. Cohen Hatton, I'm right in thinking, as you told us earlier, that from June 2017 you were head of the operational review team.
Yes.
And therefore you were responsible for incident command policy.
Yes.
Yes. And in the same role you also, I think, had oversight of the Brigade's Dynamic and Intelligent Operational Training System, or DIOT.
Yes.
Yes. And sat on the Incident Command Project Board, I think.
Yes, that's
well.
correct.
You didn't tell us that, but we know that from your statement. And that was from 2015, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
Now, would it be right to draw from the fact that you were involved in those roles that you had a considerable degree of insight into how incident commanders were being trained by the LFB?
Yes.
And drawing on your pre-LFB experience, you were in a good position, is this right, to compare that training with what happened in other fire and rescue services in the United Kingdom?
Broadly, and I could draw it to the National Operational Guidance and the intent of the National Operational Guidance also.
Yes. Can you explain how the LFB's incident command training reflected the decision-making model, the DMM?
Yes, and I think that's one of the key differences, was that London Fire Brigade didn't move to the decision control process. It maintained its use of the decision-making model, which was used as effectively to assist decision-makers to make decisions during training. So incident commanders in London would have been trained on the decision-making model. They would have received some information about it and how to use it. The training in London had changed from the old style training, of which I wasn't privy to because that was prior to my commencement in the London Fire Brigade, but there was a move, particularly at level 1 and level 2 incident command training, to try to focus more on the decision-making process. So they moved to smaller cohorts that would be involved in being coached through decisions at particular scenarios to look at how they might deal with that at an incident.
Right. Were you involved in the DCEs at all?
The DCEs?
Yes, the training
Oh, the CDEs,
exercise.
forgive
Yes.
me, the command decision exercises.
Yes, CDEs, yes.
Only in as much as I sat on the Incident Command Project Board, but initially that was more from the perspective of the providing that conduit between the commissioning departments, which was the ORT team, and operational assurance and Babcock. So I was able to advise on where national guidance departed from the activity in London Fire Brigade, but I wasn't responsible for I wasn't able to influence directly the content of training, if that answers your question.
Yes, it does. How embedded was the DMM in incident command training?
It was as embedded as it might have been in other fire and rescue services, I think is fair to say. People would have received some input on it, but I think it would be fair to say that the training of the DMM in London pretty much reflected the training of the DMM in other fire and rescue services prior to the National Operational Guidance being published.
Right. That's my question, but let me try it a different way. From what you saw, was the DMM so embedded in the minds of incident commanders from their training so as to be second nature to most incident commanders? Or was it just another piece of paper that most incident commanders disregarded once they were actively engaged at an incident?
I saw nothing that would suggest to me that the decision-making model was more embedded in London than in the minds of incident commanders elsewhere.
Maybe, but how did most of them look at it? Second nature or just a bit of paper?
I think that it would. I hadn't seen evidence of it being used during decision-making at incidents, so more so the latter.
More so the latter. Where it was used, what effect, in your view, did it have on the development of those individuals' decision-making skills at an incident?
In other fire and rescue services, or in London?
In London.
In London. I think that it was used more so during handovers and briefings to articulate the situation as it had been assessed. So the bits of information around resource information, hazard information, for example, and the overarching plan, as it were, as opposed to recognising its use to in the formulation of those plans and planning around the particular decisions that have been taken.
Now, if we were to think about the LFB's training in the light of the three phases of the normative decision-making model we've discussed already, so situation assessment, plan formulation, and then plan execution, did you consider that there was an emphasis in the Brigade's operational training on the plan execution part of incident command? In other words, that part which corresponds to acting in the DMM we saw.
I think that in the training that you would see in many fire and rescue services, the overarching emphasis is often in the plan execution, because those are the elements that you can more conceivably observe. There's less emphasis on the plan formulation itself, but what you would also see would be the questioning to gather information around the situational assessment piece. So what sources of information you would be seeking to actively inform that. But I think it's true to say the elements that are easier to judge would be the execution of those plans.
And is that because that is what the trainer sees?
That's the observable element more so.
Yes. All right. Now, thinking again about those three phases of situation assessment, plan formulation, and plan execution, to what extent did you consider that plan formulation was part of the Brigade's training of its incident commanders?
I think that it would be considered, but it would be considered in the context of the overarching incident as opposed to every decision that's made, and it should be every decision that's made in which you'd be regularly applying the decision-making tool that you would be using. And the reason I say that is when you come to assess an incident commander, for example, the assessment criteria would reflect the National Occupational Standards for an incident commander. And so it would be very focused on the outcomes of those decisions, as it were, as opposed to the way that each decision might be made and the bits of information that might be considered against each decision that's been made in the overarching incident itself.
Right. Can you see if I can understand that? So are you saying that the LFB's training, when it came to plan formulation, was to look at the outcomes and then work back from that?
More broadly, yes.
Yeah, it's a broad, unscientific, I suppose, way of putting it, but I see. So you don't actually get to see the machinery of the incident commander's brain working through the decision. You just look at the outcome and infer from that that a decision-making process must have been a good one.
More
or
so.
A bad one.
Yes, more so, particularly during assessment. Now, the one deviation to that I should point out is the refreshed incident command training, both in terms of the development training and the maintenance training, was focused on a scenario where you'd have a decision maker, an incident commander that would be going through a scenario, and at various points the trainer would pause and unpack the decisions that they were going to be making, and they'd be doing that in a group so that others who were also present could learn from that. So there was an element of trying to draw in some of the machinery, if you like, that would sit behind the decisions, but that was mainly from 2016 onwards, I believe, when the new incident command training started to go live.
Yes, I see. Now, just building on that, did training on plan formulation include the need to be able to modify an operational plan when a building or a fire behaves in a way that's unexpected?
There was an element of operational discretion that was introduced into London Fire Brigade that had an associated training package with it, and operational discretion was also one of the elements that the commissioning department had specified should be included in the incident command training itself. So there was an element of that. There were injects that were included in some of the CDEs, the command decision exercises, that may look at an unexpected event, but I couldn't speak to the number of those or the extent to which they were tested in every scenario.
Right. We may be able to identify some from the evidence we've already seen, but is your evidence that those injects were designed to teach incident commanders how to use discretion to modify an existing plan in order to deal with an unexpected development?
There were some. The greater emphasis was on the application of existing policy.
Yes, I see. Had you yourself observed in your own experience at the LFB a tendency on the part of incident commanders to experience difficulty in formulating operational plans that were adapted to particular circumstances of the fire in front of them?
I had very few occasions when I had observed people deviating from those plans, and in particular standard operating procedures. I think up to 2018, I believe operational discretion was only used around 6 times, according to Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary and Fire and Rescue Services. The overarching emphasis in London Fire Brigade was the adherence to policy, and so most of the emphasis that I saw at incidents in London Fire Brigade was focused on the application of policy and the evidence and evidence to show that.
Just in that last answer, you say that most of the emphasis you saw at incidents in LFB were focused on the application of policy. Were those incidents live incidents?
Yes.
So is what you're telling us that when you went along and observed an incident and observed the incident commander, you observed that incident commander simply following policy, or at least trying to, rather than using discretion and decision-making to adapt?
At incidents and at performance reviews of command, I think it's fair to say London Fire Brigade is a very conservative fire brigade, and there is great comfort in following the procedures that are set out. And I certainly saw evidence of that both at incidents and in post-incident debriefs. There was a great focus on following the policy.
And was that at the expense of being able to engage with new or unexpected developments in the incident?
I think that culturally there was more emphasis on following the policy than deviating from it.
Yes, but did you ever observe that that came on occasion at the expense of the ability to engage with a new development or an unexpected direction that the incident was taking?
Not directly.
Not directly. Put slightly differently, had you observed in the LFB a tendency for incident commanders to have difficulty using the DMM at incidents, as opposed to relying on their instincts and experience and common sense, perhaps?
What I saw were the majority of decisions being taken relating less to the DMM and more, if you were to refer to those particular, those normative models, it was more situation assessment, plan execution, rather than observing the plan formulation element.
I see.
Which was not unlike the research that we conducted nationally. It was a very similar pattern.
Was there, in your experience, a tendency to focus on adherence to policy and procedure, where that policy and procedure didn't actually provide that middle element, that missing element that you've just identified?
In what respect? Sorry,
in respect of the plan formulation.
The procedures were prescriptive. So it would set out a set of actions that the incident commander should take and consider. So from that regard, the direct application of the policy would somewhat negate the plan formulation element because those pieces that you refer to are pre-prescribed.
I see. So the plan formulation was already pre-prescribed in the policy, follow the policy, and you'll have the connecting element between situational assessment and execution.
Essentially, yes.
Right. Now, can I ask you to go to SMC 6011? This is the HMICFRS report inspection of the LFB done post-Grenfell, 2018 to 19, as you can see.
Yes.
Now, you say in your statement, and we don't need to go to it, but it's paragraph 11 on page 3, that you were an inspection/development lead at the HMICFRS from November 2017. Were you involved in producing this report?
No. In Her Majesty's Inspectorate for Constabulary and Fire and Rescue Services, if you are seconded to the inspectorate, you are not permitted to be involved in the inspection process for your home service in any way, shape or form.
No.
So, no, I was not.
No, all right. But can I take it that once it came out, you became familiar with it?
I read the publication when it was published, yes.
Right. You didn't get to see an advance draft?
No.
No.
In fact, I'd left the inspectorate by the time this was produced.
I see. Can we go to page 22? It's under the heading Command, which starts at the top of the screen, but it's the penultimate paragraph in that section, which I think needs to be scrolled down a bit so you can see it there. It's just about a quarter of the way down your screen. It's the paragraph that starts, "We were told." We were told that organisational culture inhibits commanders from using operational discretion. Incident commanders aren't confident that the brigade would support them in using operational discretion. Moreover, not all staff feel that the tone of the brigade's post-incident debrief meetings, which review such decisions, supports a learning environment. First, do you know who told the authors of this report that?
No.
Do you know who it was within the LFB who assisted the constabulary in compiling this report?
No, they would interview a number of people and they would only include something in a report that was triangulated from at least 3 sources of evidence. So when they would carry out an inspection, they would hold focus groups, they would have anonymous surveys that people could write into. And when I say anonymous, it's anonymous as in they don't publish the results of who said what within that. So it could have been a multitude of places, but I would suggest if there was sufficient evidence for them to have cause to write it in a report, that they would have heard it from a multitude of places.
And is this conclusion in this paragraph I've just read to you consistent with your experience of the attitude to operational discretion during your time at the LFB?
Yes, and there are 2 points that I would make in relation to that. I think the first one is to point out that the organisational culture and its impact on how you would make a decision, in particular operational discretion, isn't an issue that's exclusive to London Fire Brigade. It's something that we've noted nationally. It's something that was included in the Future of Incident Command report itself, and it's something that's been discussed at national working groups since. It is an issue that is broader than London Fire Brigade. In relation to London Fire Brigade itself specifically, I did a piece of work that looked at the PDP process in particular, but also the application of what you will have seen as IMP points, incident management points, essentially, where commanders are underperformance is identified and reported in the database. I had asked for a review of that to be undertaken, and we identified some issues with incident commanders seeing the use of those development points as very punitive, and also the PRC process itself was perceived by some to be quite a punitive environment, which meant they were more focused on providing a narrative that would prevent them from receiving an IMP point, rather than being very open and honest about the potential learning points that they might have.
Yes, thank you. We'll come to look at that in a bit more detail probably tomorrow. Possibly not, but later on. But you, I think, agree that the conclusion we see set out here was consistent with your own experience of the attitude of the LFB to operational discretion during your time. Did you see that having any impact on incident commanders' performance at incidents?
I saw incident commanders that were very focused on adhering to policy because it felt more comforting to be able to use a pre-prescribed policy. I also saw a very subjective view of how appropriate a particular action may or may not have been, I think it's fair to say, particularly in the PRC processes. So I would say, whilst not exclusively, because there were some examples, I think, of very positive PRCs in particular, I think overwhelmingly that would reflect the experience that I saw, which concerned me enough to commission the review of the PDP process.
When you say you saw a very subjective view of how appropriate a particular action may or may not have been, was that a subjective view of the interviewer conducting the PRC or the interviewee?
I think it was a subjective view of those who were judging the efficacy of the command performance. And again, this isn't an issue that would be exclusive to London Fire Brigade. I think the number of incidents that we go to has reduced over time, thereby the experience that incident commanders have has also reduced over time as well. And I think that because of the reduced experience, it can lead people to feel quite insecure sometimes about their performance. So when you challenge someone on their command performance, it can be quite emotive. And I think that certainly came through in the PRC process, where it was quite difficult to gain a really positive learning environment. On paper, it's a good process. On paper, you should be able to use that process to gather learning, to understand any areas of underperformance, and to generate organisational learning. The trouble with any process is it's applied by people. And I think that this was the challenge that we had culturally within the organisation.
Just the last two. Could you just explain that? The trouble with the process, it's applied by people. So do you mean there that it's applied by people who were perhaps not as culturally imaginative as you would have liked?
I think it's a culture that's been developed without the human factors in mind, I think is more the point that I'm trying to make. So the consideration of how the process might be applied by people in reality under the same pressures that they might be experiencing, I think is what I was trying to outline.
So I follow. Well, let's look at the human factors, because I think you mentioned earlier that you carried out research in conjunction with the University of Cardiff during your secondment to the NAG programme.
Yes.
If we go to your statement, I've already shown this, I think, to you. You said at paragraph 26 that you led the team 24-hour periods over 6 consecutive days. I've shown you paragraph 26. There it is. I think it's right that, building on what you say there, your published paper says that you followed 23 incident commanders in total, yes?
Yes.
From 6 FRSs across the country, from East Sussex to Tyne and Wear.
Yes, that's correct.
And I think 33 separate incidents in all.
Yes, that's correct.
Now, in terms of the analysis of the data that your team collected, I think you sought to apply specific code components to the commander's decision-making.
Yes.
I think you called situational awareness SA, plan formulation PF, and plan execution PE. Is that right?
That's correct.
Right. And was that achieved by a process of queued recall, whereby the commanders would be asked to review their own footage within 24 hours of the incident having taken place, and then provide a commentary for the rationale of their decisions in each case?
Yes, that's right. That meant that we were able to review the data directly from their point of view with the helmet camera that captured all of the information, but we were also then able to use the footage to assist their recall of their thought processes at that particular point in time. And
as you've referred to already, I think the findings of that research were published in the journal Human Factors in August 2015.
Yes, that's correct.
Let's go to that, LFB 00110667. And we looked at this before. The publication was Human Factors, that's the title of the publication, isn't it?
Yes, that's the journal.
That's the journal. Can we summarise your findings as follows, and tell me if any of this is wrong? Commanders were more likely to make decisions that involved transitions from situational awareness to plan execution stage, rather than transitions from situational awareness to plan formulation, as is expected by the normative model.
Yes.
Plan formulation was the least commonly occurring stage of the decision-making per incident.
Yes.
I think your figures were a mean of 5.51 occurrences as against 45.45 occurrences of situational awareness.
Yes.
And 17.06 occurrences of plan execution.
Yes.
I get all this out of your report, so it's not just a brilliant act of memory. Across the 33 incidents, 19 began, I think, with situational awareness and 13 with plan execution, but only 1 with plan formulation.
Yes, that would be correct.
And in all of those cases, I think you conclude, page 8, that there's little indication that plan formulation was followed any more often with plan execution than further situational awareness.
Yes, that's correct.
Right. This sample, what gave you confidence that the sample size gave you statistical certainty or statistical reliability?
We ran statistical tests, as you'll see in the paper itself, and it was those statistical tests that met the criteria that are set throughout research to tell you whether the correlations that you're seeing, whether those things that you're seeing happen as a result of chance, or whether there's an actual underlying relationship between those things. And I should say that in the publication process, the data that you've collected and the manuscript that you produce goes out to other researchers for peer review. So they also review not just the things that you say, but also your methodology and your application of statistical tests to ensure that it's a sufficient enough quality to make a contribution to science and hence meet the criteria to be published in a journal.
So these were, to use the language, statistically significant findings?
They were.
Is it right to say, as you go on, I think, to observe in the discussion section from page 10 of this document, that those findings are or were inconsistent with the normative three-stage model of situational awareness, followed by plan formulation, followed by plan execution?
Yes, that's right.
Now, you also say in your statement that, in fact, most decisions, and I think you accord about 80% to it, appear to rely on intuitive process.
Yes.
Does it follow from that only, this may be obvious, that only 20% of decisions are actually made after an explicit plan has been formulated?
Yes.
Can you explain why these findings are significant in relation to the way in which incident commanders are trained to make decisions under pressure?
Yes, because with such a small amount involving some critical thinking, if you like, in relation to the decision that you're about to make, and I should say actually, the other point that's relevant to the explanation that I'm about to give is that we also found relatively low levels of situational awareness in incident commanders. So if I could describe that for the inquiry, we saw incident commanders essentially making decisions based on the here and now, rather than thinking about what might happen next and basing their decision on the future state in mind, or with a consideration of the implications of the decisions that they're making. Now, when someone is making an intuitive decision, a reflexive decision, whether the mechanism is more recognition prime based or whether it's more associative based, actually the commonality is they're making that decision based on a cue or a series of cues that they might be experiencing. So if I can liken it to a piece in a jigsaw, they're making a decision based on that one particular piece rather than slotting the piece back in the overarching picture and making the decision based on that. And when you couple that with relatively low levels of situational awareness, there is a danger that it might be absolutely the right decision based on that cue alone, but if you don't consider that within the broader picture of the incident, then there might be unintended consequences. You may fall into a decision trap. You may suffer from confirmation bias because you're only attending to the bits of the situation that relate to the pattern matching process that you're going to that would trigger that particular outcome, because it's that cue or that pattern of cues. So that was the issue with only 20% of the decisions effectively involving the plan formulation element. There are some benefits to using very reflexive decision making. It's very quick. It can be very helpful in a very dynamically changing situation, and it also uses less processing power. It requires less processing power, so you have more cognitive capacity available to do other things. So I'm certainly not suggesting that intuitive decision making is a bad thing, but what you need are some controls effectively that would help to stop you falling into one of those decision traps if the process that you're relying on is an intuitive one.
Yes, I see. And you've given us an insight into the effect of the figures, 80% as against 20%. What would be the dangers? Can you illustrate the dangers of training incident commanders in a way that reflects the normative model, the DMM?
Yes, I think the danger with just solely relying on that normative model is it ignores the intuitive processes that you might use, and thereby doesn't enable you to teach what those potential pitfalls are, the reality of those decision traps, and how you might stop yourself from falling into it, because you're assuming that every decision that you make will be based on situation assessment and plan formulation and then plan execution, at which point you return on the loop and you evaluate.
Now, if we go to page 10 of this document, which is your paper, and look in the right-hand column on that page at the first sentence after the reference to Klein 1989, you say this: the observation that SA is most often immediately followed by PE suggests that particular situational cues might directly prime specific decisions that do not involve explicit PF and evaluation, but remain directed towards the objective at hand, i.e. recognition prime decisions, Klein 1993. I just emphasise specific decisions, situational cues that might directly prime specific decisions, emphasising that. Does that mean in simple terms that most of the time incident commanders' actions are a reaction to what they're seeing?
That was what we found in that in the initial research, yes.
That's the 80%?
Yes.
Right. And that you're saying that reactions can be instinctive or they can be learnt behaviour?
Yes.
Can you explain how situational cues might prime specific decisions without involving explicit plan formulation?
Yes, if you have experienced a particular cue in the environment, so something, when I'm talking about a cue, you could encompass that in situational assessment. You're assessing a situation and you're experiencing things which would provide you with information, which would help you to understand the situation. Now, if one of those pieces of information that you're seeing primes a particular response, because it might be associated with a previous experience that you've had, it might be a particular incident that's been similar, it might be a particular smoke pattern, for example, that you've experienced previously, it would prime a knowledge structure that you would have that contains, if you like, those memories, the prototype of that particular incident or the prototype of a particular action that was associated with that previously. Or it might be a more conditioned response. So you might have experienced something several times and the reaction to that becomes more of a conditioned response, like a habitual response, if you like. So in those circumstances, you're not explicitly activating plan formulation. You're not considering what the implications of that particular decision might be. You're not necessarily weighing up that option against another option and selecting the optimal one. As we saw from the line about recognition prime decision making previously, the incident commander is selecting an option that is satisfactory because it meets the criteria that are triggered by that particular exposure to that particular cue, as opposed to thinking about the decision itself in comparison to the experience that you're having, the situation as you're assessing it, and then choosing the optimal response.
Is that a case then of commanders really just drawing on their previous experiences and familiarity with certain types of events and then having that trigger an intuitive response?
Yes.
Well, would it be right to think that the intuitive response will come to you whether you like it or not? But the question is whether you should question it.
That is
That's right.
Absolutely correct. Yes.
Yeah.
And would it be right to say that these kinds of intuitive decisions aren't necessarily what I might call the correct decisions?
Yes.
And I think, is that what you mean in your statement? Perhaps I'll show it to you. Page 7, paragraph 27. Where you say in paragraph 27, just 10 lines down, you say, it's right in the middle of the paragraph, these more intuitive influences, although triggered by a specific cue in the environment, might or might not be appropriate to the entirety of the given operational environment when considered in line with all other factors. Now, and you go on to say, the influence of these associations can be very powerful. A commander may fall into a decision trap. What is a decision trap?
There are a number of decision traps. We outline them in the National Operational Guidance for Incident Command, as well as the Foundation document where we provided some more information. And if I can provide the inquiry with a few examples, confirmation bias is a decision trap whereby you will have a situation and you will essentially have an idea of what that situation might be. And so then you only attend to information that reinforces your view of what, or your understanding of the situation. situation. That would be confirmation bias. Another decision trap might be a decision inertia, for example, whereby the incident commander, in this case, would have would be faced with a situation where they feel paralysed to make a decision. They don't make a decision. They either defer the decision to another point in time, they look for additional information erroneously, or they might defer it to a different decision maker. It might be choice deferral, for example. So tunnel vision would be another example where you're focusing on a narrow aspect of the situation rather than looking at the situation in its entirety. So there are a range of decision traps that an incident commander might fall into.
And is it right to say that a decision trap is either a thought process or the absence of a thought process that can lead to a bad outcome?
Yes, that would be a fair summation.
I mean, it's probably oversimplistic. Most people would just call that an error. What's the mistake? What's the difference between a decision trap and an error?
You could describe it as either. We termed them as decision traps within the National Operational Guidance, really because we wanted to introduce a concept that people would be able to understand and to be able to relate to in some of the descriptions that we were putting in there. So we used decision traps to try to tell incident commanders that these are issues that they're issues you might fall into. It's a trap that you might fall into. But an error would still be a perfectly adequate way of describing it.
Right. And a decision trap might be an error which is made by an incident commander without them knowing that it's an error.
Yes, that's right.
On the contrary, being persuaded that because they're thinking they're making a decision, they're making the right one.
Yes, that's right.
Is what you're saying that the intuitive decisions that are more usually made by incident commanders on the incident ground can lead to unintended consequences?
Yes.
Precisely because those consequences have not been examined?
Yes, precisely.
And is that because the intuitive process doesn't tend to involve a clear stage of plan formulation, but tends to move directly to plan execution?
Yes, it's very often done without rational thought, sometimes potentially below the level of consciousness as well.
Right, and again, I apologise for reducing it, but does this mean that the intuitive decisions are typically made without the decision maker thinking through the potential consequences of their chosen course of action?
Yes.
Or weighing up the pros and cons of alternatives?
Yes, hence they've fallen into the decision trap.
They've fallen into one kind of a decision trap?
Yes.
And is that what the decision-making model was designed to avoid?
The decision-making model or the
Yes.
decision control process?
The decision-making model.
The decision-making model was, my understanding is it was developed some time ago, based on the best understanding of the people at the time. I'm not aware, and there's nothing that I have read that has led me to understand that it was designed with any of the psychology of incident command in mind.
Right, let me ask it differently. Given what you told us just now about the thinking, does the decision-making model, whatever it was designed to do, work in helping incident commanders avoid a decision trap, or does it encourage the making of a decision trap unwittingly?
Through the research and the subsequent process of developing the National Operational Guidance, we recognised that the decision-making model wasn't sufficient to help incident commanders to avoid falling into a decision trap.
And is that because the DMM is in its way flawed, or because most incident commanders can't get their heads around it and so therefore don't use it?
I think the decision-making model itself doesn't provide any inbuilt techniques or support to help a decision maker to avoid those things.
Right. So, in a case where an incident commander simply doesn't use it, doesn't think about it as an incident, he or she is exposed to a decision trap.
They could be, yes.
Or they're exposed to the risk of falling into one.
Yes.
Similarly, are you saying that where the incident commander thinks about the decision-making model and tries to use it, they're still at risk of falling into a decision trap because the decision trap is not sufficient to assist them from avoiding?
Yes,
The DMM is not sufficient to assist them avoid a decision trap.
Yes, the chairman made the point earlier on that you cannot, quite accurately, that you cannot essentially decide whether you're going to use an intuitive process or an analytical process.
Yeah.
So there very much is the point that you may make an intuitive decision and you don't have the opportunity to stop yourself making that intuitive decision.
Right. So do we end up at this point? If an incident commander doesn't use the decision-making model at all, they're at risk of falling into a decision trap. But even if they do, they're still at risk of falling into a decision trap because the decision-making model doesn't help them avoid it.
That reflects our summation when we were developing the National Operational Guidance, yes.
And that is because they're moving straight from SA to PE and not passing PF.
Yes, that's correct.
Yes, I see. Mr. Chairman, it is 2 minutes before 4:30.
Well, it's just time for me to ask one more question.
And I think you have time for one more question.
Yes. It sounds to me from what you've just been describing that the the pictorial representation of the decision-making model perhaps ought to include within it, or perhaps it ought to be added to it, a stage just before PF, which is think. I mean, it could be put in a rather more helpful way than that, but is that really what you're saying, that if you've got to the stage of making a plan, you just want to check the basis upon which you're doing it?
Yes, and in fact, the decision control process, which followed on from the decision-making model, introduced a stage by which we recognised that you would either make a decision analytically or reflexively, but the opportunity for an intervention is once you've made a decision by either one of those pathways, but before you apply the outcome of that decision.
So treat it as a provisional decision.
Precisely.
And then review it.
Precisely. And it's at that point that we introduced the decision controls, which are your essentially your check to ensure that the decision that you're making, and I'm happy to outline the decision controls now, or if that's at a later point, but essentially they were introduced as a check to help incident commanders not to fall into those decision traps, but also to raise their levels of situational awareness as well directly.
Yeah. Yes, thank you very much. Well, you've still got time to follow that up if you want.
No, because we are just about to embark on an examination of the decision control process in some detail.
So that's a convenient moment.
Tomorrow morning. Yes, yeah. Thank you.
Well, as you heard Dr. Cohen, Hatton, that's the point at which Mr. Millet's reached a sensible stage at which we should have a break for the afternoon. So we'll stop there. I'm going to have to ask you to come back for some more evidence tomorrow, but I think you were expecting that, weren't you? I
Yes.
hope so. Right, so we'll resume at 10 o'clock tomorrow, please. And again, while you're away from the hearing, please don't talk to anyone about your evidence or anything relating to it. All right? Thank you very much. We'd like to go to the usher.
Thank you.
Right, thank you, Mr. Millett. 10 o'clock tomorrow, please.
Thank you.